Hey folks, I'm excited to share some stories with you today that I've written myself. Whether you're a long-time follower or just joining us, I'd love to hear your thoughts on these tales. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe if you're new here. Let's dive in, and I hope you enjoy. My mother is a dark web scientist. Her last investigation was horrifying. Hey, everyone. I never thought I'd be sharing something like this on Reddit, but I need to get this out. It's been haunting me, and I think it might help to write it all down. I'm still trying to wrap my head around everything that happened, and part of me wonders if I'll ever be able to. So, a bit of background. My mom, she's always been a bit of a mystery to me. I mean, I knew she was into some high-level science stuff, but it wasn't until recently that I discovered just how deep and dark her work actually was. She's not your average scientist. No, she's what you might call a dark web scientist. She's been involved in projects that most people would never even dream of. It all started a few months ago when SpaceX reached out to her. Yeah, SpaceX, as in Elon Musk's SpaceX. They had discovered something bizarre, something they couldn't explain, and they needed someone with her unique expertise. They found this deserted island in the Pacific, totally off the maps, and on this island there was a plant. Not just any plant, but something that supposedly held the secret to infinite life. Sounds like some sci-fi bullshit, right? That's what I thought too. But my mom, she was intrigued. She said this could be the breakthrough she'd been searching for her entire career. And Elon Musk himself was backing the project. She packed her bags, kissed me on the forehead, and told me she'd be back soon. Weeks went by, and I didn't hear much from her. She was busy, she said. The island was even more secluded than they'd thought, and communication was spotty at best. But then, her messages started to get weird. She talked about strange occurrences, things that didn't make any sense. She described how the island itself seemed to be alive, almost breathing. The plants and trees moved, not with the wind, but on their own. And then there were the creatures. At first, she thought they were just some undiscovered species of animal. But the more she observed them, the more she realized they weren't animals. They weren't human either. They were something else entirely. One night she called me. It was the first time I'd heard her voice in weeks, and she sounded terrified. She said the creatures were watching them, studying them. She couldn't explain what they looked like over the phone, just that they were unlike anything she'd ever seen. I could hear the fear in her voice, and it scared the hell out of me. Then she told me about the investigation. They had set up a makeshift lab on the island, and she and her team were working around the clock. They were trying to understand the plant and its properties, but every time they got close to a breakthrough, something would happen. Equipment would malfunction, data would disappear, and there were these incidents. One of her colleagues went missing. They found him a few days later, or at least what was left of him. His body was torn apart, almost as if something had ripped him to shreds. My mom wouldn't go into detail, but from what she did say, it was clear that whatever had done this wasn't human. I could tell she was shaken, but she was determined to see it through. She talked about how they discovered that the plant wasn't just some miracle of nature. It was something more, something ancient and otherworldly. And those creatures, they seemed to be connected to it somehow. The last message I got from her was the most disturbing. She said she had found something that explained everything, but she didn't have time to elaborate. All she managed to say was that she was coming home and that she would explain everything when she got back. That was 2 weeks ago. I haven't heard from her since. I tried contacting SpaceX, but they wouldn't give me any information. They said it was classified and that my mom was fine, but I don't believe them. I know something went wrong on that island. I can feel it in my gut. Yesterday, I got a package in the mail. No return address, no explanation. Inside was my mom's journal. I've been reading through it, and the things she wrote, I can't even begin to describe how horrifying they are. It's like something out of a nightmare. She wrote about how the plant seemed to have a consciousness, how it could influence thoughts and emotions. The creatures, she believed, were its guardians, its protectors. And then there were her lost entries. They were frantic, almost incoherent. She talked about voices, whispers in the dark. She said she felt like she was being watched, that something was following her. I don't know what to do. I'm scared, and I don't know who to trust. I'm sharing this here because I need help. I need to know if anyone else has experienced something like this. If anyone has any idea what's going on, please let me know. I just want my mom back. Hey everyone, I'm back. Thanks for all the support and advice after my last post. I wish I had better news to share, but things have only gotten worse. After reading my mom's journal, I couldn't just sit around doing nothing. I had to find out what happened to her. So I decided to take matters into my own hands. I used every contact, every favor I could call in, and eventually I found someone who could help me get to the island. I know it sounds insane, but I needed answers. The trip was a nightmare. The island wasn't on any map, and the journey was treacherous. When I finally arrived, the place was even more desolate and eerie than I could have imagined. The air was thick with an unnatural silence, and the dense jungle seemed to close in on me from all sides. I found the makeshift lab my mom and her team had set up. It was abandoned, equipment scattered everywhere, and a thick layer of dust covering everything. The place reeked of decay. As I searched through the ruins, I found more of my mom's notes. They were worse than anything I'd read before. She wrote about how the plant wasn't just conscious, it was malevolent. It could manipulate reality, twist perceptions, and drive people to madness. The longer they stayed on the island, the more they became puppets to its will. The creatures, she discovered, were the island's enforcers. They would hunt down anyone who tried to leave, dragging them back to face unspeakable horrors. One entry stood out to me. She described an experiment where they tried to cut a sample from the plant. The moment the blade touched it, the lab was plunged into darkness. The air grew cold, and they heard whispers, low and guttural, speaking in a language no one could understand. When the lights came back on, one of her colleagues was missing. They found him later, or at least parts of him, scattered around the perimeter. I can't get the image out of my head. The way she described it, his body had been torn apart with a ferocity that no animal could muster. She wrote about finding his severed head impaled on a branch, his eyes wide open in a look of sheer terror. The plant, it seemed, had taken its first victim. As I read on, the entries grew more frantic. She wrote about the creatures in more detail. They were grotesque, twisted forms that defied any logical explanation, part human, part beast, with limbs that bent in unnatural ways and eyes that glowed with a sinister light. She described how they would appear at night, surrounding the camp, watching them with an intelligence that was both terrifying and incomprehensible. The last few entries were the most disturbing. She wrote about feeling like she was being watched, even when she was alone. Shadows moved on their own, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She started to see things, glimpses of her colleagues, long dead, standing in the corners of her vision, their eyes hollow and accusing. And then, the final entry. It was written in a shaky hand, the words barely legible. She talked about a ritual, something the plant demanded: blood, sacrifice, an offering to appease its hunger. She didn't explain much, just that she had to do it. She wrote about feeling a presence in her mind, pushing her, guiding her. She mentioned seeing her own reflection, but it wasn't her. It was something else, something dark and twisted, wearing her face like a mask. I spent a night in that cursed lab, unable to sleep. The island felt alive, like it was watching me, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. I started to hear the whispers my mom described, low and unintelligible, but filled with malice. I saw shadows moving in the corners of my vision, shapes that seemed to disappear when I turned to look at them directly. The next day, I ventured deeper into the jungle. I found a clearing where the plant stood, towering and grotesque. It pulsed with an unnatural energy, its tendrils writhing and reaching out, as if sensing my presence. The air around it was cold, and the ground was littered with bones, human bones, picked clean and bleached white. That's when I saw them. The creatures. They emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing with a predatory intelligence. They moved with an eerie grace, circling me, their twisted forms almost too much for my mind to comprehend. I felt a wave of terror wash over me, paralyzing me in place. And then, one of them spoke, not in words, but in my mind. It was a voice, deep and resonant, filled with a cold malice. It told me that the island was a prison, a place where ancient horrors were contained. The plant was a guardian, a key to keeping those horrors at bay. And my mom, she had disturbed the balance, unleashed something that couldn't be contained. I barely escaped with my life. I ran blindly through the jungle, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. I felt like I was being chased, the creatures always just behind me, their eyes burning into my back. When I finally reached the shore, I collapsed, exhausted and terrified. I made it back to civilization, but I'm not the same. I can still hear the whispers, still see the shadows moving in the corners of my vision. I don't know if I'm cursed, or if the island left a mark on me. All I know is that my mom is still out there somewhere, and I have to find her. But I'm scared. Scared of what I'll find, and scared of what I've become. Hey, it's me again. Thanks for sticking with me through this. I've been piecing together more of what happened, and it's worse than I could have ever imagined. Every time I think I have reached the end of this nightmare, something else pulls me deeper. After escaping the island, I returned home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whispers followed me, growing louder at night, and I started seeing things, shadows moving in ways they shouldn't, reflections in the mirror that didn't match my movements. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on that island, surrounded by those creatures, hearing their voices in my head. I decided to dig deeper into my mom's research. I needed to understand what she had found and why it had driven her to madness. I went through her files, her emails, anything I could get my hands on. That's when I found it. A hidden folder on her computer, protected by layers of encryption. It took me days to crack it, and what I found inside was horrifying. She had documented everything: the plant, the creatures, the strange occurrences on the island. But there was more. She had recorded conversations with Elon Musk and other top scientists at SpaceX. They knew the risks, knew that the island was dangerous, but they were desperate. The plant held the key to something they couldn't ignore, the secret to eternal life. In one of the recordings, Elon's voice was calm, almost excited. He talked about the potential of the plant, how it could revolutionize humanity. But there was an edge to his words. He mentioned the creatures, calling them guardians and necessary sacrifices. It was clear that he knew more than he was letting on. The more I listened, the more I realized that my mum had been used. She was a pawn in a game far bigger than she understood. SpaceX had sent her to the island knowing that it was a one-way trip. They needed her expertise to unlock the plant's secrets, but they didn't care about the consequences. Then I found the video. It was the last thing she recorded before everything went to hell. She looked terrified, her eyes wide and haunted. She talked about the plant's influence, how it could control thoughts and emotions, twist reality. She said that the plant wasn't from Earth, that it was a remnant of an ancient alien civilization, a piece of a dead world that had found its way to ours. But the worst part was when she described the ritual. The plant demanded a sacrifice, a blood offering to unlock its true power. She didn't go into details, but the look on her face said it all. Whatever she had done, it had changed her. She talked about feeling a presence in her mind, something dark and malevolent, whispering to her, guiding her actions. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to find her, needed to know if she was still alive. I reached out to some of her colleagues, trying to get more information. Most of them were too scared to talk, but one of them finally agreed to meet me. We met in a dingy bar, the kind of place where no one asks questions. He was jittery, looking over his shoulder every few seconds. When he finally started talking, his voice was low, almost a whisper. He told me about the last days on the island, how the team had started turning on each other. The plant's influence was growing stronger, driving them to madness. He described how they had found my mom in the middle of the night, standing in front of the plant, covered in blood. She was chanting something, a language none of them understood. They tried to stop her, but it was too late. The creatures appeared, dragging them into the jungle one by one. He was the only one who managed to escape, hiding in the underbrush until morning. When he returned to the camp, it was empty. Everyone was gone, including my mom. I asked him if he knew where she might have gone, but he just shook his head. He said that the island had a will of its own, that it could manipulate reality, create illusions. He was convinced that my mom was either dead or worse, something else entirely. I left the bar feeling more lost than ever. My mom's journal, the recordings, everything pointed to one conclusion. The island had changed her. It had twisted her mind, turned her into something unrecognizable. But I couldn't give up. I had to know the truth. I returned home and started preparing. I needed to go back to the island, find my mom, and put an end to this nightmare. I gathered supplies, booked a flight, and steeled myself for what lay ahead. The whispers were getting louder, the shadows more persistent, but I pushed through. I had to do this. Before I left, I received one final message. It was an email from an unknown sender with a single sentence. "The island is calling." Attached was a photo of my mom, standing in front of the plant, her eyes hollow and empty. She was holding something in her hand, a piece of the plant, glowing with an eerie light. I don't know what I'll find when I get there, but I have to try. I have to save her, or at least find out what happened. This is my last hope, my final chance to end this madness. I'll update you all when I can. If I don't make it back, remember my story. The island is real, and it's hungry. Hey, everyone. It's been a while since my last update. I wish I could say things have gotten better, but I'm afraid the nightmare is far from over. I returned to the island, and what I found there has changed me forever. I'm still trying to process everything, but here's what happened. The journey back to the island was grueling. Every part of me wanted to turn back, to forget about all this and go back to some semblance of normal life. But I couldn't. Not with my mom's fate hanging over me. When I finally reached the island, it felt like stepping into another world. The air was heavy with an oppressive silence, and the jungle seemed even more alive than before, almost watching me. I made my way back to the lab, or what was left of it. The place was in ruins, but I found more of my mom's notes scattered around. They were even more disturbing than before. She wrote about the plant's growing influence, how it seemed to feed on their fear and despair. The creatures were becoming more aggressive, and she felt like she was losing her mind. I followed her trail deeper into the jungle, guided by her lost entries. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and I heard whispers in a language I couldn't understand. It was like the island itself was alive, aware of my presence. I found another clearing, where the plant stood. It had grown even larger, its tendrils writhing and pulsating with an eerie glow. I saw markings on the ground, symbols carved into the earth around the plant, and I knew they were part of the ritual my mom had mentioned. Then I saw her. She was standing in front of the plant, her back to me. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. As I got closer, I realized she wasn't alone. The creatures were there, surrounding her, their eyes glowing with that same predatory intelligence. They didn't attack me though. They just watched, waiting. When I finally reached her, I saw that she was holding a piece of the plant, just like in the photo. Her eyes were empty, hollow, and she didn't seem to recognize me. She started chanting in that strange language, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The air around us grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I tried to snap her out of it, shaking her, yelling at her to come back to me, but it was like she was in a trance, completely under the plant's control. The creatures started to move closer, and I knew I had to do something. I grabbed the piece of the plant from her hand and threw it to the ground. The moment it hit the earth, the ground shook, and the plant let out a horrible, screeching sound. My mom collapsed, and the creatures recoiled, their eyes burning with anger. I picked her up and ran, not looking back. The jungle seemed to close in around us, the shadows twisting and writhing, trying to pull us back. The whispers were deafening, but I kept going, fueled by pure adrenaline and fear. We made it to the shore, and I managed to get us on the boat I had hired. My mom was unconscious, but she was alive. As we left the island, the whispers started to fade, but the feeling of being watched never left. We're back home now, but my mom is still in a coma. The doctors can't explain it, and I don't know if she'll ever wake up. The whispers have stopped, but I still see shadows moving in the corners of my vision. I feel like the island left a mark on me, something dark and twisted that I can't shake. I've been going through more of her notes, trying to understand what happened. I found a final entry that she never finished. She wrote about the plant's origins, how it was part of an ancient alien civilization that had been destroyed. The plant was a weapon, a way to control and manipulate life, and it had found its way to Earth, waiting to be discovered. She wrote about the ritual, how it was a way to communicate with the plant, to unlock its full potential, but it came with a price. The plant demanded a sacrifice, a blood offering to satiate its hunger. My mom had tried to resist, but the plant's influence was too strong. It had taken control of her, using her to carry out its will. The last thing she wrote was a warning. She said that the plant wasn't just confined to the island, that its influence could spread, infecting anyone who came into contact with it. She begged whoever found her notes to destroy them, to never let the knowledge fall into the wrong hands. I don't know what to do now. I'm scared for my mom, and I'm scared for myself. The island, the plant, it's all still out there, waiting. I can't shake the feeling that this is far from over, that something dark and terrible is still watching, waiting for its next victim. If you're reading this, please be careful. There are things in this world that we're not meant to understand, things that can drive us to madness. My mom tried to warn us, and now I'm doing the same. Stay safe, and remember, the island is real, and it's hungry. Hey everyone, this will be my final update. I've been through hell and back, and I finally have some answers, but the cost was more than I could have ever imagined. After bringing my mom back from the island, I couldn't just leave it all behind. The things she discovered, the horrors she endured, it felt like a part of me now. I had to know the truth, had to find a way to end this once and for all. I spent weeks researching, diving deeper into her notes, trying to piece together the puzzle. One night, as I was poring over her lost entry, my mom woke up. Her eyes were wide and filled with a terror I'd never seen before. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong, and whispered, "It's not over. They're coming." Before I could respond, she collapsed again, slipping back into unconsciousness. But her words stuck with me. I knew that whatever was on the island wasn't done with us. Desperate for answers, I reached out to an old colleague of my mom's, a scientist who had worked with her before she was contacted by SpaceX. He was reluctant to talk at first, but when I mentioned the island, he agreed to meet. We met in a secluded cabin far from the city. He was paranoid, constantly checking the windows and doors. He explained that he had been part of a secret project years ago, something involving ancient alien artifacts. The plant my mom had discovered was one of those artifacts, a remnant of a civilization that had been wiped out eons ago. He told me about the true nature of the plant. It wasn't just a key to eternal life. It was a conduit, a bridge between our world and theirs. The creatures were its guardians, yes, but they were also its prisoners. The plant fed on life, on fear, and it needed sacrifices to maintain the bridge. As he spoke, I felt a cold dread settle over me. It all made sense now. The whispers, the shadows, the sense of being watched. The plant was trying to come through, to merge our world with its own. My mom had unknowingly unleashed something far worse than she could have ever imagined. Before we could finish our conversation, the cabin door burst open. The creatures were there, more grotesque and horrifying than ever. They moved with a terrifying speed, and I barely had time to react. My mom's colleague screamed as they dragged him away, his cries echoing in the night. I ran, heart pounding, knowing I had to end this. I made my way back to the island, determined to destroy the plant once and for all. The journey was a blur of fear and adrenaline, but I knew what I had to do. I carried with me the knowledge of the ritual, the only way to close the bridge and seal the plant's power. When I arrived, the island seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The jungle was alive with whispers, and the shadows seemed to move with a will of their own. I found the plant, larger and more monstrous than before. Its tendrils reached out, almost as if it was expecting me. I began the ritual, chanting the words my mom had written in her notes. The ground shook, and the air grew cold. The creatures appeared, but they kept their distance, watching with those glowing eyes. As I continued, the plant's tendrils writhed, and I could feel its anger, its desperation. I completed the ritual, and the plant let out a piercing scream. The ground split open, and a blinding light engulfed the clearing. The creatures howled, their forms dissolving into shadows as the light consumed them. The plant began to wither, its tendrils curling and turning to ash. When the light faded, the island was silent. The plant was gone, and the creatures with it. I felt a sense of relief, but also a deep sadness. I knew that the price had been high, and that my mom had paid it in ways I couldn't fully understand. I returned home, exhausted and broken. My mom remained in her coma, but I felt a sense of closure. The whispers were gone, and the shadows no longer moved. The island's influence had finally been destroyed. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching, waiting. The island may be gone, but the darkness it held is still out there, lurking in the corners of our world. So, if you ever find yourself drawn to places that should remain hidden, remember my story. There are things in this world and beyond that we are not meant to understand. My mom tried to unlock the secrets of the universe, and it cost her everything. Stay safe, and remember, some doors are better left unopened. My girlfriend took a pill from the dark web. She kept having dreams of another world. Alright, Reddit, I've never posted anything like this before, but I'm at my wit's end and I just need to get this out there. This all started about 6 months ago when my girlfriend Jess decided to order something off the dark web. She's always been into weird shit, but this was on another level. Jess and I were pretty close. We moved in together after dating for a year. She's the adventurous type, always pushing boundaries, and usually I'd be right there with her. But when she told me she ordered some experimental pill from the dark web, I thought she'd finally lost it. One night, we were just lounging around, and she pulled out this tiny, unmarked bag. Inside was a single black pill. It didn't look like any drug I'd ever seen. She told me it was supposed to give you dreams of another world, something beyond our reality. I laughed it off, thinking it was a waste of money, but she was dead serious. She took the pill that night. The first couple of nights, nothing really happened. She said her dreams were just a bit more vivid, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then on the third night, She woke up screaming. I'd never heard her make a sound like that before. It was primal, like an animal in pain. Her eyes were wide, and she was shaking uncontrollably. I held her until she calmed down, and she told me about her dream. She said she was in a dark, desolate place, with shadows moving around her. She could hear whispers, but couldn't make out what they were saying. The worst part was that she felt like she was being watched, but she couldn't see who or what it was. Over the next few weeks, the dreams got worse. She'd wake up with scratches and bruises, swearing that something was attacking her in her sleep. I started to get really worried, but she refused to see a doctor. She was convinced that these dreams were real, that she was actually traveling to another world when she slept. One night, I woke up to find her sitting at the edge of our bed, staring at the wall. Her eyes were glazed over, and she was mumbling something under her breath. I shook her, trying to snap her out of it, but she wouldn't respond. I had to physically drag her back to bed, and even then, she didn't wake up. The next morning, she had no memory of what happened. I started noticing changes in her behavior during the day too. She became distant, barely speaking to me, and spent hours just staring out the window. Her once bright and lively eyes now looked empty, haunted. She lost weight, stopped eating, and seemed to be wasting away before my eyes. One night, I heard her talking in her sleep. I leaned in close to try and make out what she was saying, and what I heard chilled me to the bone. She was speaking in a language I didn't recognize, but her voice sounded different, almost inhuman. It was deep and guttural, nothing like her usual voice. The dreams were taking a toll on her physical health too. She'd wake up with bloodshot eyes, her skin pale and clammy. One morning, I found her vomiting black bile. I tried to convince her to see a doctor, but she refused. She kept saying that the dreams were important, that she was learning something from them. Then about a month ago, she started drawing. She filled notebooks with sketches of the things she saw in her dreams. The images were horrifying. Twisted, nightmarish creatures with too many eyes and sharp, jagged teeth. There were landscapes that looked like they came straight out of a horror movie, with dark, looming structures and a blood-red sky. I couldn't take it anymore. I told her she had to stop, that these dreams were killing her. She just looked at me with those empty eyes and said, "It's too late. They know I'm here now." That night, she had the worst episode yet. She woke up screaming, her body convulsing violently. I tried to hold her down, but she was thrashing around so much that I could barely keep her still. When she finally stopped, she was covered in scratches and bite marks. Her eyes were wild, and she kept saying, "They're coming for me." I didn't know what to do. I felt completely helpless, watching the woman I loved being torn apart by something I couldn't see or understand. I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow, just in case. Then one night, I woke up to find her standing over me, holding the knife. Her eyes were completely black, no whites, just pure darkness. She whispered, "It's time." And before I could react, she plunged the knife into her own chest. I managed to stop the bleeding and get her to the hospital, but she was in a coma for weeks. When she finally woke up, she didn't remember anything. Not the dreams, not the dark web pill, nothing. It was like a reset button had been pressed. But I remember, and I'm terrified, because sometimes when she's asleep, I can hear her talking in that strange, inhuman voice, and I can't help but feel like whatever she saw in those dreams isn't done with her yet. Alright Reddit, here's the update. I wish I could say things got better, but honestly, they've only gotten worse. After Jess woke up from the coma, I thought maybe we were out of the woods. She didn't remember anything about the dreams or the pill, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that the nightmare was over. The doctors kept her in the hospital for a few more weeks, just to make sure she was stable. She seemed almost normal during the day, but the nights were another story. I stayed with her every night, sitting by her bed, and sometimes I'd hear that strange guttural voice again. It was like something else was using her to speak. One night, I was jolted awake by the sound of her monitors beeping wildly. Jess was thrashing around, her eyes wide open but unseeing. Nurses rushed in, trying to hold her down, but it was like she had superhuman strength. She was screaming in that bizarre language again, her voice deep and echoing through the room. The hospital staff sedated her, and she finally calmed down. They said it was just a bad reaction to the trauma, but I knew better. There was something inside her, something that was trying to break through. We brought her home, eventually. She seemed better during the day, almost like her old self, but there was always this underlying tension. She'd space out sometimes, just staring into nothing, and when I'd ask her what she was thinking about, she'd just say, "Nothing," with that empty look in her eyes. A few nights after we got home, I woke up to find her standing by the window, her back to me. The moonlight cast an eerie glow on her, and she was muttering under her breath. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was menacing. I called her name softly, trying not to startle her, but she didn't respond. When I touched her shoulder, she turned to me with those same black eyes I'd seen before. "It's coming," she whispered, her voice not her own. I jumped back, my heart pounding in my chest. She blinked, and her eyes returned to normal. She looked confused and scared, asking me what was wrong. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I saw. How could I explain that she was possessed by something from her dreams? The next day, I found more of her drawings hidden under the bed. The creatures were even more disturbing than before. One of them stood out, a tall, shadowy figure with long, spindly arms and no face, just an empty void where its face should be. I couldn't shake the feeling that this thing was watching us, even in the waking world. I started researching everything I could about sleep disorders, demonic possession, anything that might explain what was happening to Jess. I found forums and chat rooms where people shared similar experiences, but none of them had a solution. Just more horror stories that made me feel even more hopeless. One night, I was scrolling through one of these forums when I heard a soft tapping sound. I looked over at Jess, who was sound asleep, then around the room. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. It seemed to be coming from the walls. I walked around, trying to pinpoint the source, but it was everywhere and nowhere at once. Suddenly, the room grew cold. I could see my breath in the air, and the tapping grew louder, more insistent. I heard a faint whispering, like 100 voices all speaking at once. I felt something brush past me, a cold, clammy hand grazing my arm. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Jess started to stir, her eyes fluttering open. She sat up slowly, her movements jerky and unnatural. The whispers grew louder, and she started to chant in that guttural language again. Her voice was a low, rumbling growl, completely unlike her own. I tried to wake her, to snap her out of it, but she was like a statue, unmovable and unresponsive. Her chanting grew more intense, and I felt a pressure in the room, like the air was being sucked out. I could barely breathe, my chest tight with fear. Then just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Jess collapsed back onto the bed, her breathing shallow but steady. The cold dissipated, and the room was silent again. I sat there shaking, unable to comprehend what had just happened. In the morning, Jess was herself again, cheerful and oblivious to the horrors of the night. I felt like I was losing my mind, trapped in a waking nightmare with no escape. I couldn't tell her what was happening, afraid of how she'd react, afraid she'd think I was crazy. But I knew I couldn't keep this up. Whatever was haunting her was getting stronger, and it was only a matter of time before it broke through completely. I had to find a way to stop it, to save her from whatever hell she'd unleashed upon herself. And that's when I remembered the pill. It all started with that damn pill. If I could find out where it came from, maybe I could find a way to reverse its effects. Desperate and running out of options, I turned back to the dark web, hoping against hope that I could find the answers I needed before it was too late. Back on the dark web, I was navigating a digital underworld that I barely understood. The first time I accessed it was through Jess's guidance. She knew all the ins and outs, which made it easier then. Now, fumbling through various hidden forums and marketplaces, I realized how deep this rabbit hole went. I found the site where Jess ordered the pill, buried deep within a labyrinth of twisted and encrypted pages. The site had a dark, minimalistic design with cryptic symbols and eerie imagery. My heart raced as I browsed through the listings, each more bizarre and horrifying than the last. Eventually, I found the pill. It was listed as the Gateway Pill, Explore Other Realms. The seller had a cryptic name, something like Eternal Voyager. I sent a message, desperate for any information that could help. Hours turned into days with no response. Meanwhile, Jess's condition continued to deteriorate. The chanting at night grew more frequent, the voices louder, the cold, the whispers, the tapping sounds. It was all getting worse. Finally, I received a reply. The message was short and to the point. You have no idea what you've done. Meet me at the coordinates below. Come alone. The coordinates pointed to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. It looked like something out of a horror movie. Broken windows, rusting metal, and an overgrown yard. I knew it was risky, but I was out of options. I told Jess I had to run some errands and headed out, my heart pounding with fear and anticipation. The warehouse loomed ominously in the fading daylight. I parked a block away and approached on foot, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know what was happening to Jess. Inside, the place was even worse. The air was thick with dust and the stench of decay. I walked through the maze of abandoned machinery and debris, the silence only broken by the occasional creak of the old building settling. In the center of the warehouse, I found him. Eternal Voyager was a gaunt, middle-aged man with wild eyes and a scraggly beard. He looked like he hadn't seen the sun in years. He stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. You shouldn't have come, he said, his voice a harsh whisper. But since you're here, you need to understand what you're dealing with. He explained that the pill was an experimental creation designed to open the mind to other dimensions, other realities, but it was unstable, dangerous. Most people who took it went insane or worse. Jess had been exceptionally strong-willed to last this long. She's been marked, he said. They know she's there. and they won't let her go. They'll keep coming for her, trying to drag her fully into their world. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who are they?" I asked. He shook his head. "Names have power. It's best you don't know. But they are ancient, malevolent beings that exist beyond our comprehension. The pill made her visible to them, and now they want her." Desperation clawed at me. How do I stop it? How do I save her? He looked at me with pity. "There's no easy way. The only chance you have is to sever the connection completely. You'll need to perform a ritual, one that will close the gateway for good, but it's dangerous. And if you make a mistake, you could end up worse than her." He handed me an old, tattered book. It was filled with symbols and incantations, written in a language I couldn't understand. "Everything you need is in here, but be warned, this is dark magic. It requires a sacrifice." I took the book, my hand shaking. "What kind of sacrifice?" His eyes bore into mine. "A life for a life. To save her, someone else must take her place. It's the only way." I left the warehouse in a daze, the weight of the book like a leaden burden in my hands. The drive home was a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the choice I had to make. Could I really condemn someone else to save Jess? And who could I possibly choose? When I got home, Jess was waiting for me. She looked frail, her eyes haunted. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I couldn't tell her the truth. "Just running some errands," I lied, forcing a smile. She didn't press the issue, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. That night, the voices were louder than ever. The tapping became a constant, maddening rhythm. Jess woke up screaming again, her body racked with convulsions. I held her, feeling utterly powerless. As I looked at her, so vulnerable and terrified, I knew I couldn't give up on her. I had to perform the ritual, no matter the cost. I spent the next day studying the book, trying to decipher the ancient language and the complex steps of the ritual. The more I read, the more I realized how dangerous this was. One wrong move, and I could doom us both. But I had no choice. Jess's condition was worsening by the day. She was slipping away, and I couldn't let that happen. I gathered the necessary materials and prepared myself mentally for what I had to do. The night of the ritual, I set up everything in our basement. Candles, sigils, and the necessary tools were all laid out according to the book. Jess was in bed, unaware of what I was about to attempt. My heart pounded as I began the incantation, my voice trembling with fear and determination. The air grew cold, the candles flickering as if they were caught in an unseen breeze. Shadows danced on the walls, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. I focused on the incantation, pouring all my will into the words, praying that this would work. As I reached the final verse, a presence filled the room. It was dark, oppressive, and filled with malice. The shadows coalesced into a shape, the faceless figure from Jess's drawings. It loomed over me, its empty gaze piercing my soul. I held my ground, finishing the ritual with a final, desperate plea. "Take me instead," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Just let her go." The figure hesitated, then slowly nodded. I felt a searing pain in my chest, like my very essence was being torn apart. The shadows swirled around me, enveloping me in darkness. I could hear Jess's screams in the distance, but they grew fainter, as if she was being pulled away. And then there was silence. I woke up on the basement floor. The candles burned out, the room eerily quiet. Jess was standing over me, her eyes filled with tears. "It's over," she whispered. "They're gone." I pulled her into my arms, relief flooding through me. We had done it. She was safe. But as the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started hearing whispers in the night, seeing shadows move out of the corner of my eye. I knew that I had made a deal, and now it was my turn to pay the price. The nightmares began shortly after. Dark, twisted landscapes and malevolent beings haunted my dreams, just like Jess's drawings. I knew they were coming for me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I don't have much time left. I can feel them getting closer, even when I'm awake. I wanted to warn you all, to let you know what happened, in case anyone else is tempted to try that pill. It's not worth it. The other world is real, and once you're marked, there's no escape. Jess is free now, but I'm doomed. The shadows are closing in, and soon I'll be gone. If you're reading this, please, stay away from the dark web. You don't know what kind of horrors you might unleash. I can hear the tapping again. They're here. If you've made it this far, Reddit, I appreciate you sticking with me. Things have taken a darker turn since my last update. I thought I could handle it, that sacrificing myself would end this nightmare, but I was wrong. Whatever I invited into my life has taken root, and it's only getting worse. It started with the shadows. They became more frequent, more tangible. I'd see them everywhere, in the corners of rooms, lurking just out of sight. Jess noticed my deteriorating condition, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the full extent of what was happening. How could I? She had finally escaped her torment, and I didn't want to drag her back into the darkness. My nights were filled with nightmares. The same faceless figure haunted me, its presence oppressive and suffocating. The landscapes were twisted and foreign, filled with grotesque creatures that seemed to be waiting for me to make a wrong move. Each night I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a drum. Jess tried to comfort me, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew something was terribly wrong, even if she didn't remember the details of her own ordeal. She suggested seeing a doctor, but what could I say? Hey doc, I'm being haunted by interdimensional demons because my girlfriend took a dark web pill. They'd lock me up and throw away the key. One evening, Jess found me sitting in the dark, staring at nothing. She gently touched my arm, and I flinched, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. Talk to me, she pleaded. What's happening to you? I couldn't keep it from her any longer. I told her everything, the whispers, the shadows, the nightmares. Her face paled as I spoke, but she listened intently, not interrupting. When I finished, she took a deep breath and said, "We need help. We can't do this alone." She was right. We needed someone who understood this kind of thing. I remembered a name I'd come across during my research, Dr. Caldwell, an expert in the paranormal. He had written several books on demonic possession and interdimensional entities. Desperate, I reached out to him, explaining our situation in as much detail as I could without sounding completely insane. To my surprise, he responded quickly. He agreed to meet us, but his message was filled with warnings. "This is dangerous territory," he wrote. "If what you're describing is accurate, you're dealing with entities beyond our understanding. Be prepared for anything." Dr. Caldwell arrived at our house. A few days later, he was an older man with a stern face and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through you. He brought with him a collection of ancient texts and strange instruments. Jess and I watched as he set up in our living room, creating a circle with candles and drawing intricate symbols on the floor. "This will help us see what we're dealing with," he explained. "But be warned, once we start, there's no turning back." We nodded, our fear palpable. As he began chanting in a language I didn't recognize, the room grew colder, just like during the ritual. The shadows in the corners seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting. The candles flickered violently, casting eerie shapes on the walls. Suddenly, Jess started to convulse, her eyes rolling back into her head. I rushed to her side, but Dr. Caldwell held up a hand to stop me. "It's beginning," he said, his voice steady. "We need to let it run its course." Jess's body went rigid, and she began speaking in that deep, guttural voice again. The language was the same as before, filled with dark, ancient power. The shadows coalesced into the figure I had seen so many times in my nightmares, tall, faceless, and menacing. Dr. Caldwell continued his incantation, his voice growing louder and more forceful. The figure seemed to react, shifting and writhing, but it didn't disappear. Instead, it reached out towards Jess, its long, spindly arms stretching across the room. I couldn't just stand there. I grabbed the book the Eternal Voyager had given me, frantically searching for something, anything, that might help. My hands trembled as I found the page describing a banishment ritual. I began to chant, my voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. The air grew thick, and the pressure in the room intensified. The faceless figure turned its attention to me, its presence almost unbearable, but I kept chanting, pouring all my will into the words. Dr. Caldwell joined in, our voices merging in a desperate attempt to drive the entity back. Jess screamed, a blood-curdling sound that echoed through the house. The figure recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. The shadows writhed and twisted, as if in agony. The temperature plummeted, frost forming on the windows and walls. And then, with a final deafening roar, the figure dissolved into nothing. The shadows retreated, and the room grew still. Jess collapsed, her body limp but alive. I rushed to her side, checking for a pulse. It was weak, but steady. She was breathing. Dr. Caldwell slumped against the wall, exhausted but triumphant. "It's not over," he said, his voice hoarse. "But we've bought some time." We helped Jess to the couch, and Dr. Caldwell explained what we needed to do next. The entity had been weakened but not destroyed. It would return, and we needed to be ready. He left us with instructions and a promise to return if we needed him. The following days were a blur of preparations and constant vigilance. Jess slowly regained her strength, but the haunted look in her eyes remained. The whispers were still there, faint but persistent, and the shadows seemed to watch us, waiting for the right moment to strike. We knew we were living on borrowed time. The entity would come back, stronger and more determined. We had to find a way to destroy it, once and for all, or it would take us both. As we delved deeper into the dark arts and ancient rituals, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were in over our heads. But there was no turning back. The only way out was through, and we were determined to see it to the end, no matter the cost. The days leading up to the final confrontation were filled with a sense of impending doom. Jess and I barely slept, haunted by the lingering presence of the entity that seemed to lurk just beyond our perception. We followed Dr. Caldwell's instructions meticulously, preparing for what we knew would be the ultimate battle for Jess's soul, and possibly my own. Dr. Caldwell returned one evening with more supplies, and a look of grim determination. "This will be the hardest thing you've ever done," he said, setting up a circle of protection in our living room. "But if we fail, you both may be lost forever." We gathered around the circle, Jess, Dr. Caldwell, and I. He handed me a dagger, its blade inscribed with ancient runes. "This is our last resort," he explained. "If the ritual fails, you must use this to sever the connection between Jess and the entity. It will be irreversible." I nodded, my heart heavy with the weight of what he was asking me to do. Jess looked at me with tears in her eyes, understanding the gravity of the situation, but ready to face it head on. "We can do this," she whispered, squeezing my hand. Dr. Caldwell began the ritual, chanting in that strange, powerful language. The air grew cold, the candles flickering as a dark presence filled the room. Jess started to tremble, her eyes rolling back as the entity began to manifest. The shadows coalesced once more into the tall, faceless figure. It loomed over us, more solid and menacing than ever before. Its presence was suffocating, and the whispers filled my mind, telling me to give up, to surrender. But I couldn't. I had to protect Jess. Dr. Caldwell's chanting grew louder, more forceful. The entity recoiled, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it lashed out, a tendril of darkness striking Caldwell and sending him crashing into the wall. He groaned, struggling to rise, but the entity's focus was now solely on Jess. She began to convulse, her body lifting off the ground as if an invisible force was pulling her. I grabbed the dagger, my hands shaking. The room was filled with a deafening roar, the shadows swirling around us in a violent storm. With a final, desperate cry, I plunged the dagger into the ground, right in the center of the protective circle. The blade glowed with a blinding light, and the entity let out a horrible, ear-piercing screech. The light spread, enveloping Jess and the entity, burning away the darkness. Jess fell to the ground, unconscious but alive. The entity writhed, its form disintegrating in the intense light. The whispers turned into screams and faded into silence as the shadows dissipated. I rushed to Jess's side, cradling her in my arms. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at me, dazed but aware. "Is it over?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I think so," I said, my own voice shaking with relief and exhaustion. Dr. Caldwell approached us, his face pale but determined. "We did it," he said, "but there will be scars. This kind of trauma doesn't just disappear. You both will need time to heal." We spent the next few weeks recovering, physically and emotionally. The house felt different, lighter, as if a dark cloud had finally lifted. Jess still had nightmares, but they were less frequent, and the shadows no longer seemed to watch us. One night, as we sat together on the couch, Jess turned to me with a determined look in her eyes. "We need to tell our story," she said. "People need to know what happened, so they don't make the same mistake." So here I am, writing this final part of our story. If you're reading this, please heed our warning. The dark web is a dangerous place, filled with unknown horrors that can reach into our world and destroy lives. Stay away from things you don't understand, and never, ever take a pill from the dark web. We survived, but not without scars, and we'll carry those scars for the rest of our lives. But we're alive, and we're together, and that's more than we could have hoped for.